On a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, a man named Harlan Jessup drove his pickup truck down a gravel county road in Stafford County, Kansas, and stopped at the end of a neighbor's fence line. He didn't knock on the door. He didn't call ahead. He just backed his truck to the fence, unloaded a cast-iron centrifugal pump that weighed somewhere around 340 pounds, set it in the grass, and drove away. The pump had a cracked volute casing, a seized impeller shaft, and a bearing housing so corroded it had fused to the mounting plate. It hadn't run in 11 years. Harlan had tried twice to get it rebuilt. Both times the machinist told him the same thing. Parts don't exist for that model anymore, and even if they did, the labor would cost more than a new pump. So he'd done what most farmers in Stafford County did with things that were broken beyond economic repair. He hauled it to the fence line of a man named Emtt Hassel. Let me tell you about Emett Hassel, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Emmett was 58 years old in 1987 and had farmed 320 acres of bottomland along the Rattlesnake Creek drainage for most of his adult life. The land had been in his family since his grandfather, a German immigrant named Emtt Hassel, had broken sod there in 1911. August had arrived in Kansas with $11, a wife, 2 children, and a mechanical aptitude so thorough and instinctive that the other settlers in the area had taken to calling him the Fixer within 2 years of his arrival. Emtt Hassel could look at a broken thing and understand it the way other men understood weather or soil, not through analysis exactly, but through a kind of deep familiarity that felt almost like kinship. He passed that quality to his son Werner, and Werner passed it to Emmett. And by 1987, Emmett had been repairing farm equipment for 40 years, with the same unhurried certainty his grandfather had brought to the Kansas prairie in 1911. But here is the thing about Emtt Hassel that you need to understand. He didn't advertise. He didn't hang a sign. He didn't charge money for most of what he did, and he never once called himself a mechanic or a machinist or anything else that would have implied a professional identity. He was a farmer who fixed things. The distinction mattered to him. What he was, specifically, was a man who understood pumps. Not just how they worked in the general sense that any competent farmer understands the equipment he depends on, but how they worked at the level of metallurgy and tolerance and wear pattern and fluid dynamics. He had taught himself to read a worn impeller the way a doctor reads an X-ray. The erosion pattern told him the pump's history, the cavitation damage told him how it had been run, the bearing wear told him whether it had been maintained or just used until it quit. He had a metal lathe in his shop that had belonged to his grandfather, a 1938 South Bend 9-inch that August had bought second-hand from a railroad maintenance shop in Pratt. He had a drill press, a surface grinder, a small mill, and a collection of measuring instruments, micrometers, bore gauges, dial indicators, that he had accumulated over 30 years with the patience of a man who buys one good tool at a time and keeps it forever. The fence line along the county road had started collecting pumps in 1972. That was the year Emmett had rebuilt a neighbor's irrigation pump, a 1950s-era Fairbanks-Morse centrifugal that had thrown a bearing and scored the shaft. And word had gotten around the way word gets around in a county of 4,200 people. By 1975, 3 or 4 pumps a year were appearing at his fence. By 1980, it was closer to 10. By 1987, when Harlan Jessup backed his truck up and unloaded that cracked cast-iron pump, There were 23 pumps already sitting in the grass along Emmett's fence line, in various states of disrepair, in various stages of Emmett's attention. Emmett never turned one away. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. What does it mean to keep something everyone else has decided is finished? Not out of sentimentality, not because you can't afford to replace it, but because you look at it and see what it still is rather than what it can no longer do. That is a particular kind of vision, and it is rarer than most people understand. Most of the world is organized around replacement. Something breaks past a certain threshold, and the calculation shifts. The cost of repair exceeds the cost of new, and the broken thing becomes a liability, a problem to be disposed of. Emtt Hassel had never entirely accepted that calculation. Not because he was stubborn or eccentric or hoarding things the way some men do, but because he had grown up watching his father and grandfather take broken things apart and understand them, and somewhere in that process he had come to believe that understanding was worth something that didn't show up in a cost-benefit analysis. The pumps along his fence line were not junk to him. They were problems he hadn't solved yet. Let me tell you about what Stafford County looked like in those years, because the pumps didn't appear in a vacuum. The 1980s were not kind to the Kansas wheat and sorghum country. The farm crisis that had been building since the late 1970s had arrived with full force by the early part of the decade. Land values that had doubled and tripled during the inflationary 1970s collapsed. Interest rates on operating loans climbed past 18%, and commodity prices fell hard enough that farmers who had borrowed against inflated land values found themselves underwater in ways that took years to fully comprehend. Stafford County lost 140 farms between 1981 and 1989. Some of those families sold out voluntarily. Some were foreclosed. Some just quit, packed what they could, left what they couldn't, and drove away from land their grandparents had broken with horses and hand tools. The equipment they left behind, or couldn't afford to repair, or couldn't justify paying a dealer to service, had to go somewhere. Some of it went to auction. Some of it went to the salvage yard in St. John, and some of it, the pumps specifically, went to Emmett Hassel's fence line. The pumps came from irrigation systems, from livestock water systems, from grain handling operations, from small rural water cooperatives that had been running the same equipment since the 1950s and couldn't afford the repair bills the dealers were quoting. The dealers, and there were two in the county, a Gorman-Rupp distributor in Pratt and an independent irrigation supply outfit in St. John, had largely stopped stocking parts for anything manufactured before 1970. The economics made sense from their perspective. Why warehouse parts for a 1955 pump when you could sell the customer a new one? The problem was that in 1985, in Stafford County, Kansas, a lot of farmers couldn't buy a new one. So the old pumps broke and sat, and then they went to Emmett. By 1990, the fence line had 31 pumps. By 1995, it had 47. The collection had become a local landmark of sorts. People drove past it the way you drive past something that's been there long enough to become part of the landscape. The county assessor had been out twice to look at it, trying to determine whether it constituted salvage inventory subject to taxation. Both times, Emmett had explained patiently that these were not inventory items. They were equipment belonging to neighbors that he was in the process of repairing, and both times the assessor had driven away without a clear answer. What the assessor didn't fully appreciate, and what most people in the county didn't fully appreciate, was that Emmett was actually repairing them. Not quickly, not on any schedule that a commercial shop would recognize, but steadily, one at a time, in the order they had arrived, with the patience of a man who had nowhere else to be and nothing more important to do. Let me tell you about how Emmett worked, because the method was as important as the result. He would bring a pump into his shop and disassemble it completely. Every bolt, every gasket, every bearing, every seal, every wear ring, every piece of the impeller assembly, laid out on a workbench in the order it had come apart. Photographed with a Polaroid camera he kept on a shelf above the bench. He had a notebook for each pump, a composition notebook with the owner's name and the date of arrival written on the cover in his precise, small handwriting. Inside the notebook, he recorded every measurement he took, every wear pattern he observed, every part number he could find, and every calculation he made about what the repair would require. Some of those notebooks ran to 40 pages. Some of the pumps had been so thoroughly stripped of identifying markings by corrosion and time that he had to reverse engineer the original specifications from the dimensions of the surviving parts. He sourced parts from everywhere. He had relationships with 3 industrial salvage dealers in Kansas City, 1 in Wichita, and 1 in Tulsa. He subscribed to a half-dozen used machinery catalogs. He had a correspondence, actual letters in envelopes with stamps, with a retired pump engineer in Cincinnati named Delbert Mast, who had spent 40 years at a major pump manufacturer and who could identify almost any centrifugal pump made in the United States between 1930 and 1975 from a photograph and 3 measurements. When parts didn't exist, Emmett made them. The South Bend lathe in his shop could hold a tolerance of 0.005 of an inch in the hands of someone who knew how to use it, and Emmett knew how to use it the way his grandfather had taught him. Slowly, carefully, measuring twice and cutting once and never being in a hurry about it. The work cost him money. Not enormous amounts, but real amounts. Parts, materials, the occasional machining job he couldn't do himself, the postage for all those letters to Delbert Mast in Cincinnati. He kept a running total in each notebook. Most pumps cost him between $80 and $400 to repair, depending on what they needed. He never sent a bill. When he finished a pump, he called the owner. If the owner had moved away, and by the mid-1990s, a lot of them had, he tracked down a forwarding address or a phone number through the county extension office or through mutual acquaintances. If he couldn't find the owner, he kept the pump. He never sold one. He never parted one out for the useful components. He fixed them and returned them, and if he couldn't return them, he kept them whole. Now, let me tell you about the part of this story that most people in the county missed, because they were looking at the fence line and seeing a collection of junk, and they weren't looking at the notebooks. By 1997, Emmett had repaired 34 pumps and returned them to their owners or their owners' successors. He had 19 more in various stages of repair in his shop and along the fence line. He had spent, by his own accounting in a conversation with his son, Dale, somewhere around $11,000 of his own money on parts and materials over 25 years. He had spent uncountable hours, and he had accumulated, in those composition notebooks, one of the most detailed practical records of centrifugal pump failure and repair in the state of Kansas. Not because he set out to create such a record, but because he was a methodical man who wrote things down. The dealer in Pratt, a man named Rick Thornton, who had taken over the Gorman-Rupp distributorship from his father in 1988, was aware of Emmett's fence line the way everyone in the county was aware of it. He had driven past it, He had heard the stories. He had, on at least 2 occasions, had customers mention Emmett's name when declining to purchase a replacement pump. This irritated him in the way that things irritate people who have built a business on a particular model and then encounter something that doesn't fit the model. Rick Thornton was 44 years old in 1997, had a business degree from Kansas State, had grown the distributorship's revenue by 60% in 9 years through aggressive inventory management and a service contract program that had become the standard in 4 counties. He drove a new F250 and wore a Carhartt jacket that had never seen a day of actual farm work. He was not a bad man. He was a competent businessman who had built something real, and who had a very clear idea of how the pump business worked and who the relevant players were. Emtt Hassel did not fit into his understanding of the relevant players. In the spring of 1997, Rick Thornton stopped his truck on the county road in front of Emmett's fence line. He sat there for a few minutes looking at the pumps. Then he drove to Emmett's door and knocked. Emmett answered and invited him in for coffee, the way you do in Stafford County, regardless of who's knocking. They sat at the kitchen table, and Rick Thornton explained, with the careful politeness of a man who has rehearsed what he's going to say, that he had a business proposition. He was expanding his service operation. He needed someone with mechanical knowledge to run a pump rebuild program. There was a market for it. He'd done the analysis. The margins were there if you had the right person. He was prepared to offer Emmett a contract arrangement. He would handle the customer relationships and the billing. Emmett would do the technical work. They would split the revenue. Emmett listened to all of this without interrupting. Then he asked Rick Thornton how he intended to handle the pumps that were already at the fence line. Rick Thornton said those pumps were a problem, actually. He'd been meaning to mention it. The liability exposure of having all that equipment sitting on an unfenced property line was significant. His insurance agent had flagged it as an issue. He thought the cleanest solution would be to haul them to the salvage yard in St. John and start fresh with a proper intake process. The kitchen went quiet. Emmett set down his coffee cup. He looked at Rick Thornton for a moment without saying anything. Then he said, "Those pumps belong to people." Rick Thornton said he understood that, but practically speaking, after 10 or 15 years, the original owners had moved on. The equipment had no realistic return path. The salvage value would offset some of the cost of a proper facility build-out. Emmett said, "I know where every one of those owners is." Rick Thornton's smile stayed on his face, but it had gotten smaller. He left without a deal. On his way out, he told a mutual acquaintance, a feed dealer named Wes Crowley who supplied both men, that Emtt Hassel was a nice enough old fellow, but that he was sitting on a pile of scrap and calling it a repair business, and that the county would be better served by a professional operation with proper facilities and liability coverage. Wes Crowley repeated this to 3 people, the way things get repeated in a county of 4,200 people. And within a week, most of the farming community had heard some version of Rick Thornton's assessment. Emmett heard it too. He didn't say anything about it. He went back to his shop and kept working. Let me tell you about what happened in the summer of 1999, because that summer was the reason this story is still being told. The summer of 1999 brought a drought to the south-central Kansas wheat country that was the worst anyone under 70 could remember. It didn't arrive all at once the way some droughts do. It came in the way a slow leak comes. You notice the soil is a little dry and then a little drier, and then you start watching the sky the way farmers watch the sky when they're worried, and then the worry becomes something else, something harder and quieter. By July, the subsoil moisture readings in Stafford County were at levels the Extension Service hadn't recorded since 1956. By August, the pasture grass was burning brown before it could be cut. Livestock tanks were dropping. The irrigation wells that fed the bottomland fields along the creek drainages were running harder and longer than they'd run in years, and the pumps that drove those irrigation systems were showing the stress. On the 14th of August, a farmer named Vernon Backer, who ran 480 acres of irrigated sorghum along the North Fork of the Rattlesnake Creek drainage, lost his main irrigation pump. It was a 1978 Gorman-Rupp T-Series centrifugal, a good pump, a pump he'd maintained reasonably well, but it had been running 18 hours a day for 6 weeks, and the mechanical seal had finally given out and taken the shaft with it when it went. Vernon called Rick Thornton's dealership in Pratt. Rick Thornton's service manager told him they could get a replacement pump in 7 to 10 business days and have it installed within 2 weeks of that. Vernon Backer said his sorghum crop would be dead in 10 days if he didn't have water. The service manager said he understood that and was sorry, but that was the timeline. Vernon Backer hung up the phone and drove to Emtt Hassel's farm. He found Emmett in the shop working on a pump, a 1961 Aurora centrifugal that had belonged to a family named Rasmussen, who had sold out in 1991 and moved to Wichita. Emmett listened to what Vernon needed. He asked what model the failed pump was. He asked what the impeller diameter was and what the system head requirements were. He went to a filing cabinet in the corner of the shop and pulled out a folder. Inside the folder were the specifications for every pump currently sitting along his fence line and in his shop. He walked Vernon out to the fence line and stopped in front of a pump that had been sitting there since 1988. It was a 1974 Gorman-Rupp T-Series centrifugal, the same family of pump as Vernon's failed unit. It had come from a farm operation that had gone through foreclosure in 1988, and the bank that had taken the property had eventually sold the land, but hadn't known what to do with the pump, and someone, Emmett couldn't remember exactly who, had hauled it to the fence line sometime that fall. Emmett had disassembled it in 1994, found that it needed a new impeller and a shaft sleeve and both mechanical seals, sourced the parts through his contact in Kansas City, and had it sitting in the shop in a state of about 80% completion when other work had pulled him away from it. He told Vernon he could have it running in 2 days. Vernon Backer stood there looking at the pump, which was sitting on a wooden pallet in the grass, and then he looked at Emmett, and then he said, "What do you want for it?" Emmett said, "I don't want anything for it. I want to finish it and put it in your system and make sure it runs right." 2 days later, Emtt Hassel drove to Vernon Backer's farm with the rebuilt pump in the bed of his truck. He spent the better part of a day installing it, aligning the drive coupling, priming the system, and running it through a full performance check. The pump delivered 340 gallons per minute at the design head. Vernon's sorghum got its water. The crop survived the drought. But Vernon Backer was not the only farmer in Stafford County who lost a pump that summer. By the end of August, the drought had pushed irrigation systems across the county to their limits. 6 more pumps failed in the space of 3 weeks, 2 along the Rattlesnake Creek drainage, 1 on a wheat farm east of Maxville, 2 on livestock operations in the eastern part of the county, and 1 at a small rural water cooperative that served 11 households along a county road near Zenith. Each failure was its own crisis. Each farmer called Rick Thornton's dealership first, because that was the established thing to do, the way the system was supposed to work. Each one got a version of the same answer. 2 to 3 weeks for parts and installation. In a drought, 2 to 3 weeks was not an answer. It was a sentence. 4 of those 6 farmers drove to Emett Hassel's farm. Let me tell you about what Emmett's fence line had become by that point, because you need to understand what he was actually sitting on. Over 27 years, 61 pumps had come to that fence line. Emmett had returned 38 of them to their owners. He had 23 remaining, some in various stages of repair, some complete and waiting for owners he hadn't been able to locate, some that had arrived recently and hadn't yet been opened. Of those 23, he had complete specifications and parts assessments in his composition notebooks for all of them. He knew what each one needed. He knew which ones were closest to completion. He knew which ones could be matched to which applications. He was not a dealer. He was not a parts supplier. He was not a commercial operation of any kind. He was a farmer with a lathe and a filing cabinet full of notebooks and 27 years of accumulated knowledge about the pumps of Stafford County, Kansas. He found matches for 3 of the 4 farmers who came to him that August. 1 pump he finished in a day and a half. 1 he finished in 3 days. The 3rd required a part he didn't have, a specific wear ring for a 1969 Fairbanks Morse, and he spent 2 evenings on the phone with his contacts in Kansas City and Tulsa before he found one at a hydraulic supply house in Oklahoma City, paid overnight shipping out of his own pocket, and had the pump running 4 days after the farmer arrived at his door. The 4th farmer, a man named Dale Sorensen who ran a livestock operation near Belpre, needed a pump configuration that Emmett didn't have a match for. Emmett told him so directly, gave him the exact specifications he needed, and told him who to call at the Gorman-Rupp distributor in Hutchinson, which was a different dealership from Rick Thornton's operation, and which Emmett believed could get the part faster. Dale Sorensen got his pump in 8 days instead of 3 weeks. The rural water cooperative near Zenith was the last of the 6 failures. The cooperative's pump was a 1957 Lane and Bowler turbine pump that had been installed when the cooperative was formed and had been running, with periodic maintenance, for 42 years. When it failed, the cooperative's board of directors called Rick Thornton's dealership, which told them that a replacement turbine pump of that capacity would cost $14,000 installed and take 4 to 6 weeks to arrive. They called a second dealer in Wichita who quoted $12,500 in 6 weeks. They were 11 households. Some of them had children, some of them had livestock. They didn't have 4 to 6 weeks, and they didn't have $12,500. Someone on the board knew about Emtt Hassel's fence line. They drove out to see him. Emmett walked them out to the fence line and showed them a 1961 Lane and Bowler turbine pump that had come to him in 1993 from a farm that had been absorbed into a larger operation. The original owner had told Emmett he didn't need it anymore, that the new operation had its own equipment, and that Emmett could have it if he wanted it. Emmett had wanted it. He had disassembled it, found it in remarkably good condition, replaced the bowl bearings and the column pipe packing, and reassembled it. It had been sitting complete and ready for 6 years. The cooperative's pump was installed in a well casing of a different diameter than the one the Lane and Bowler had been designed for. Emmett spent 3 evenings designing and machining an adapter assembly on the South Bend lathe. The cooperative's board watched him work one of those evenings, standing in the doorway of his shop with the August heat still coming off the ground outside, watching a 70-year-old man measure and cut and measure again with the focused patience of someone who has never learned to be in a hurry. The pump went in on a Saturday. It delivered water to 11 households by Saturday afternoon. The cooperative offered to pay him. Emmett said the pump had been given to him, so it wasn't his to sell. He said the materials for the adapter had cost him $47, and they could cover that if they wanted. They gave him $200, and he accepted it without argument. Now, let me tell you about Rick Thornton, because he heard about all of this, and what he did next is the part of the story that deserves its own telling. Rick Thornton heard about Vernon Backer's pump from West Crowley at the feed store. He heard about the cooperative's pump from a county commissioner who mentioned it at a Rotary lunch in Pratt. He heard about the other 3 from various sources over the course of September. Each time he heard about it, something shifted slightly in his understanding of what Emtt Hassel's fence line actually was. He had looked at it for years and seen a liability problem, a collection of worn-out equipment that a sentimental old man had been unable to throw away. He was beginning to understand that he had been looking at it wrong. In October of 1999, Rick Thornton drove to Emmett Hassel's farm for the second time. He knocked on the door. Emmett let him in and made coffee. Rick Thornton sat at the kitchen table and said he wanted to talk about what had happened over the summer. He said he thought he'd made a mistake 2 years ago when he'd suggested hauling the pumps to the salvage yard. He said he'd been thinking about it since August, and he thought there might be a way to work together that would benefit both of them and benefit the county. He had connections, inventory systems, a customer base. Emmett had knowledge and stock that had taken 27 years to accumulate. Together, he thought, they could build something. Emmett listened to all of this. Then he said, "You told West Crowley I was sitting on a pile of scrap." Rick Thornton's voice had lost some of its certainty. He said he had said something like that, yes, and that he'd been wrong to say it. Emmett looked at him for a moment. He was not a man who enjoyed other people's discomfort. He was also not a man who pretended things hadn't happened. He said, "Those pumps kept 11 families in water this summer. They kept Vernon Backer's sorghum crop alive. They did it in days, not weeks, and they did it for the cost of parts and materials." He paused. "That's not a pile of scrap. That's 27 years of work." Rick Thornton said he knew that now. They talked for 2 hours. They didn't reach an agreement that day. Emmett wasn't interested in a commercial arrangement, and Rick Thornton gradually came to understand that pressing for one would be the wrong approach. What they arrived at instead was something more informal, an understanding that when Rick Thornton's dealership encountered a situation where the standard lead time was unacceptable and the customer's need was urgent, he would call Emmett. Not as a subcontractor, not as a supplier, just as a call, neighbor, to ask whether Emmett had anything that might help. Emmett said that was fine. Over the next 6 years, Rick Thornton made that call 11 times. Emmett was able to help on 9 of them. He never charged Rick Thornton anything. Rick Thornton, for his part, started sending parts Emmett's way, surplus inventory, odd lots from estate sales, components that came in on trade-ins and had no obvious home in his system. He started doing it quietly, without making a production of it, the way you do a thing when you're trying to correct an error without drawing attention to the correction. Let me tell you about the notebooks, because the notebooks deserve their own accounting. By the time Emtt Hassel turned 75 in 2004, he had 67 composition notebooks on the shelf above his workbench. Each one represented a pump. Each one contained the complete disassembly record, measurement data, part sourcing history, and repair documentation for one machine. Collectively, they represented something that had no real equivalent in the county. A practical archive of pump failure modes, repair techniques, and parts availability for agricultural and rural water equipment spanning 5 decades of Kansas farming. The Kansas State University Extension Service, when they learned about the notebooks through a county agent named Page Drummond, who had been making farm visits in the area, sent a graduate student out to talk to Emmett about them. The graduate student spent 3 days at Emmett's kitchen table going through the notebooks and came back to Manhattan with 40 pages of notes and a recommendation that the Extension Service consider funding a formal documentation project. Emmett declined the documentation project. He said the notebooks were working documents, not museum pieces, and that as long as he was working, they were going to stay where they were. He kept working until he was 78. The last pump he repaired was a 1966 Berkeley centrifugal that had belonged to a family named Lindgren, who had farmed along the South Fork of the Rattlesnake Creek drainage until 1995. It had come to the fence line in 1996. Emmett had been working on it intermittently for years, held up by a specific bronze impeller that had proved nearly impossible to source. He finally found one through Delbert Mast in Cincinnati, who was 84 years old by then and still corresponding by letter, in the fall of 2007. He finished the pump in November of that year, tracked down the Lindgren family's youngest son in Wichita, and called to tell him the pump was ready. The son, whose name was Eric Lindgren and who was 41 years old and had not farmed a day in his adult life, drove out to Stafford County on a Saturday and stood in Emmett's shop looking at the rebuilt pump. He didn't have a use for it. He didn't have land to put it on. He asked Emmett what he should do with it. Emmett said he didn't know. He said it was Eric's pump and Eric's decision. Eric Lindgren stood there for a while and then he said, "Can I leave it here?" Emmett said he could. Emtt Hassel died in March of 2009 at the age of 79 from a stroke that came on a Wednesday morning while he was in his shop. His son, Dale, found him that afternoon. He was sitting in the chair at his workbench with a composition notebook open in front of him and a pencil in his hand. The notebook was for a pump he hadn't quite finished, a 1958 Worthington centrifugal that had come to the fence line in 2001 and that had given him more trouble than almost anything he'd worked on. The last entry in the notebook, written in his small, precise hand, was a measurement. Shaft diameter at bearing journal, 1.2487 inches. Below it, in the same hand, a note. Check tolerance against original spec, may need sleeve. He never got to the sleeve. Dale Hassel was 52 years old when his father died, and he had grown up watching his father work the way children grow up watching the things that define their parents. Not always understanding it, not always sharing it, but absorbing it nonetheless. He had helped in the shop since he was old enough to hold a wrench. He had watched his father write in the composition notebooks. He had watched the pumps come to the fence line and leave again, repaired, and he had understood from an early age that this was not a hobby or an eccentricity but a practice, a deliberate, principled practice of attention and care that his father had inherited from his grandfather and that had its own logic and its own value, even when that value was hard to explain to someone standing at the fence line looking at what appeared to be a collection of junk. Dale Hassel finished the 1958 Worthington centrifugal himself. It took him 4 months, partly because he had to learn some of what his father had known, and partly because the sleeve issue turned out to be exactly as complicated as his father had suspected. He found the tolerance specification in a 1958 Worthington service bulletin that was in a file folder in his father's filing cabinet, between a 1961 Gorman-Rupp parts list and a hand-drawn cross-section of a Fairbanks Morse impeller that Emtt Hassel had sketched sometime in the 1940s. He machined the sleeve on the South Bend lathe, which was by then 71 years old and still holding tolerance, and installed it and ran the pump on a test stand he built in the shop yard. It ran correctly on the first try. He called the owner, a man named Chester Novak, who had brought the pump in 2001 and had long since given up expecting to hear about it again, and told him it was ready. Chester Novak drove out, looked at the pump, and asked Dale what he owed him. Dale said the parts had cost $63. Chester Novak wrote him a check for $500 and told him to keep the change. Dale Hassel has been running the shop since 2009. He is 67 years old now. He does not have his father's depth of knowledge. He says this himself, without embarrassment, the way honest people acknowledge the limits of their inheritance. But he has the notebooks, all 67 of them, plus the 11 he has added himself. He has a lathe, which he had professionally serviced in 2012, and which he uses regularly. He has the filing cabinet with the parts lists and the service bulletins, and Emtt Hassel's hand-drawn cross-sections. He has the fence line, which still has pumps on it, fewer than in his father's time, but some. And he has the practice, which is the most important thing, the thing that can't be inventoried or assessed or hauled to the salvage yard in St. John. Let me tell you about what Rick Thornton did in the spring of 2010, because it matters. Rick Thornton had sold his dealership in 2006 to a regional irrigation supply company out of Wichita and had largely retired from the pump business. He heard about Emmett's death through Wes Crowley, who was still running the feed store in 2009 and who still knew everything that happened in the county. Rick Thornton drove out to the Hassel farm in April of 2010, a year after Emmett died. Dale answered the door and let him in. Rick Thornton sat at the same kitchen table where he had sat twice with Emmett, and he said he wanted to pay his respects and that he'd been thinking about Emmett a lot since he died, and that he wanted to say something he should have said years earlier. Dale Hassel waited. Rick Thornton said, "Your father was the most knowledgeable man about pumps I ever met in this business. I spent 9 years in this county telling myself he was an amateur, and I was wrong about that. He wasn't an amateur. He was just working at a scale I didn't understand." Dale Hassel said his father would have appreciated that. Rick Thornton asked if he could look at the notebooks. Dale showed him the shelf. 67 composition notebooks in 2 rows, each one labeled in his father's small hand. Rick Thornton stood there looking at them for a long time without saying anything. Then he said, "He wrote all of this down." Dale said, "He wrote everything down." Rick Thornton said, "I had a customer database and a parts inventory and a service history system. Cost me $40,000 to build. Your father had composition notebooks and a pencil." He paused. "His worked better." Let me tell you one last thing, because the story doesn't end with Rick Thornton's visit or with Dale running the shop, or even with the 1958 Worthington centrifugal running correctly on the first try. In the summer of 2019, Dale Hassel's daughter, a woman named Nora Hassel, who was 28 years old and had a degree in mechanical engineering from Kansas State, and had come back to Stafford County 3 years earlier after deciding she didn't want to work for a defense contractor in Wichita, brought a pump to her father's shop. It was a submersible turbine pump, a modern unit, the kind of thing that had replaced the old centrifugal surface pumps on most irrigation systems in the county over the previous 20 years. It had failed in a way that the manufacturer's technical support line had been unable to diagnose over the phone. The farmer who owned it had been told by 2 dealers that it needed to be replaced, that the failure mode was not repairable in the field, and that the cost of factory rebuild exceeded the cost of a new unit. Nora had looked at it for an afternoon and thought she knew what was wrong. She thought the failure was in the motor winding insulation, not the pump end, and that it had been caused by a specific pattern of voltage fluctuation from the variable frequency drive controller that the farmer had installed 2 years earlier to save energy. She thought the pump end was fine. She thought the motor could be rewound. She brought it to her father and explained what she thought. Dale listened to her the way Emmett had listened to things, without interrupting, without rushing to judgment, with the patience of someone who has learned that the first step in understanding a problem is letting the problem be fully stated. When she finished, he said, "Can you fix it?" She said she thought so. She said she'd need the motor rewound by a shop in Pratt, and she'd need to modify the VFD programming to prevent the voltage fluctuation from recurring, and she'd need to run it on a test stand before reinstalling it to confirm the diagnosis. Dale said, "Then fix it." She fixed it. The motor rewind cost $340. The pump was reinstalled and ran correctly. The farmer, who had been quoted $8,500 for a replacement unit, paid Nora $600 and told everyone he knew. Dale Hassel watched his daughter work on that pump with the same focused patience he had watched his father work for 50 years. He didn't say much about it. He didn't need to. He got out a new composition notebook, number 79 in the sequence, and wrote her name on the cover, and the date, and the pump model, and set it on the workbench next to her tools. That notebook now has 14 entries. Nora Hassel is working through them one at a time, in the order they arrived, with the unhurried certainty of someone who learned from people who learned from people who understood that the work itself is the point, that the knowing is worth more than the billing, and that some things people call junk are only junk because nobody has taken the time to understand them yet. The fence line still has pumps on it. The South Bend lathe is 86 years old and still holds tolerance. The filing cabinet still has August Hassel's hand-drawn cross-sections in it, between the parts lists and the service bulletins, sketched in pencil on paper that has gone soft and brown at the edges. And somewhere in a box on the shelf above the workbench, there are 67 composition notebooks in Emtt Hassel's small, precise hand, and 11 more in Dale's, and a 79th that is filling up in Nora's, and the thing that connects all of them, the thread that runs from August breaking sod in 1911 to Nora rewinding a motor in 2019, is not the lathe or the notebooks or even the pumps. It is the decision, made by each of them in turn, to look at a broken thing and see what it still is. That is what happens when a family decides, generation after generation, that understanding is worth more than